Welcome to Underdubs, a podcast about 70s progressive rock and more. This podcast is a conversational music variety show with a focus on the classic progressive rock artists of the 1970s and how their music has shaped culture, technology, and the music of today. We'll, of course, cover the classic prog bands like Yes and Genesis, but also other forms like the Canterbury scene, neo-prog, proto-prog, and fusion, and all points in between. Your hosts, Brian Donahue and Pat Strawser, are two of the founding members of the instrumental progressive rock fusion band Volare, based in Athens, Georgia, from the mid-1990s. In this episode of Underdubs, we talk to JoE Silva, author of the MiniMoog Book. Be sure to check out the links that we provide in the notes for playlists and other content that we discuss here. We hope you enjoy the show.
Well, Brian, we have a really cool guest today. We have JoE Silva, the author of this beautiful coffee table book, the MiniMoog Book. This thing is amazing. And I'm not just saying that because you're here with us. But since you are here with us.
You could just actually, bolt 4 table legs under that, and you could use it as ridiculously big as it turned out to be in the end.
Right. Well, I mean, just to start, give us a little bit of background on you I know your background is as a journalist, correct? Is that primarily? Okay.
Yeah. So I've done music journalism on and off for, I don't know, way too many years, like 30 something years. And at some point, as somebody who had way too many children to feed, I was always looking for another freelance gig. And I used to write about electronic music and then electronic music instruments. And somehow I got on the radar of Moog up in Asheville. And they hired me. It was probably like 2009 or so. They hired me to do things like, they would have product launches. Like they had that Minotaur. I don't know if you remember that little synth. It was like a one oscillator, bass synth. And I wrote the pamphlet that if you bought it, it came in the box with a nice little pamphlet. And so I would write the text for things like that, or the Voyager XL, things like that. And then we got to talking about, I guess, the anniversary of the MiniMoog was coming up. And they said, oh, it'd be cool to do something. And I was like, sure, whatever you want. And then that conversation sort of progressed to maybe we should do something long form. And originally they thought they were going to be the ones to publish this book. And there's a lot of fits and starts about, of getting it done. And at the end of the day, they're just a small company that can do one great thing is put out synthesizers, let alone publish books. And so that was like probably 2010. And again, it started, stopped. And then finally we connected with Moogs over in Denmark. And they've done, you've probably seen some of their other books. They've done Patch and Tweak with Moog and things like that. And they just kind of connected us. And about, that's when the work really started, like 2.5 years, really heads down, just kind of pushing towards a deadline, before it came out finally.
So it sounded like Moog came to you to do a piece on the MiniMoog. It wasn't you had a particular affinity for the instrument necessarily.
Right. It was one of those things where whatever they kind of put my way, I was happy to take, because, it's just another sort of a freelance thing. They gave me access to all of their, their contacts, all their artist contacts, and I just started interviewing people and just kept on doing that until we finally, connected with Moogs and had a real deadline.
Man, the list of artists in this is understandably bananas.
Yeah.
Because the history, I feel like the history of the instrument almost doesn't even need to be, you almost don't need to tell it at this point. In some ways, it's entered public consciousness in such a strong way with not one, but 2 reissue releases in the last, because there was the reissue in 2016 and the other one I think it's 2022. They did another one. I mean, it holds that much staying power. But yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit about some of the folks you interviewed and what was that like? Who were some standouts that you spoke to?
The one of the best ones was one of the first ones that I did was Rick Wakeman, because, if you know anything about him, he's just a really funny guy. He tells great stories. He's very willing to go off color and just say whatever is in his mind. So, that was, I think I had to get up at 5 a.m. because of the time difference to do that. Right. But he was really, really fun. Let me see. Another good one was Gary Newman. Because, when I was growing up in the 80s, people, didn't give him a lot of respect as an artist, especially in the States. Cars was thought of as a novelty record, and, he looked a little bit odd and stuff like that. And he's a really sweet guy, and, he's super talented. He is not the person who can, you give him a MiniMoog and say, look, I need a clarinet sound, and he's like, whoop, whoop, whoop. He's not going to do that, but his aesthetic choices and when it comes to sound are just great. This is a very instinctive player, so he was another really good one. Who's the fellow that it is George Duke, though, right? He played with Zappa, and he played. He was sort of a soul funk kind of player. Yeah. He was also great because he was the kind of guy who is very much like. I mean, he is a player, and he pointed out to me that something that I really hadn't thought of, in terms of he had at various times when he was playing with Zappa and wasn't playing with Zappa, he had an ARP Odyssey, and had a lot of experience with the MiniMoog as well, and he kind of was able. He's one of those guys who can sit there and really make distinctions about the subtleties of those instruments. I mean, a lot of people say, well, they're both monosynths from the 70s. They're, almost interchangeable. If you show up and, one doesn't work, you can always, and it's not quite like that. I think that, the what people will say is the legend about the MiniMoog is true. When it comes to the end of the bottom end of the spectrum, I mean, you put that through an amplifier and it's just, it'll rattle some rooms,
Mm-hmm. I've always thought that to the general public, anyway, because the name recognition of Moog or Moog, as most people would probably say it, that like you get the kind of Kleenex Xerox effect where in the minds of many listeners, even music fans, like any synth from the 70s, like, oh, well, that's a Moog. That's got to be the MiniMoog. There's Keith Emerson with his MiniMoog plugging in patch cables, and you're like, well, no, not exactly. There's more subtlety involved than that. Yeah.
I think MiniMoog is almost, it's sort of like walking into a cafe or someplace and just ordering a Coke. Well, we have Pepsi.
Yeah, right.
It's sort of a catch. It's a synonym for soft drink.
Yeah. He was, Keith was fun too, because I think when I spoke to him, I think he had been out late and wasn't still recovered from the evening before. So that made for a good conversation. And, wow. I actually got to meet him at Moog Fest one year because, I don't know if you guys remember, but Moog, re-released, in a sense, they offered anybody who could afford it, they would make a Keith Emerson modular, and he was there. And it was very sweet,
I was curious, is your background additionally as a musician? I mean, do you play in bands or do you play keyboards, or like what's your tie-in there with that?
I used to be a drummer for a while, and then my wife thought, we could probably, use the space that my drums were occupying for, a bassinet for the children. So I was encouraged strongly to maybe take up a different hobby, so I haven't played with other people in quite some time. But there was maybe you guys remember this, but like probably sometime in the mid '90s. Do you guys remember the X-Ray Cafe in Athens? It's just right up the street from the 40 Watt.
I remember the name, but
It was a shop that kind of sold a bunch of different stuff, books and records and curios and stuff like that. But there was I started getting a lot of keyboards into review. I mean, pretty much anything that was new, I would somehow wrangle a review of it for some magazine that I was writing for, whether it was Future Music or there was a magazine called Remix for a while that I wrote for, Sound on Sound, and we had a little bit of an electronic music scene there where every month the deal was you had 10 minutes. You could bring whatever gear you wanted and you could play a 10-minute piece, and then the next person would go. And then you had 30 days to come up with a fresh piece. And we did this for quite a while. We actually released a record. It's out there somewhere. It's called Scenes from the X-Ray Cafe, where we had, sort of the mainstays of that scene kind of contribute a track. And I have something on there, and a bunch of other local musicians sort of appeared on that record. So for a long time, and I've always had, a fascination with synthesizers. So there always something in my office that, probably should be used for better space purposes. Even though
I was always a drummer, I, for a while, was a keyboard collector. And so Pat and I, in our Athens days together, where he was the guy that played them, and then he and I would go hunting in pawn shops and stuff. And I still have that MicroMoog that I bought at a pawn shop in Nashville, Tennessee, for $75 in sometime in the 90s, early 90s, I guess. It still works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we at that time we had a whole stack of stuff. We went through a couple of Fender Rhodes pianos, a Juno 6, a couple. Well, I think all of the Junos at some point. Farfisa or two. The MicroMoog, we had another one. I've got one in here in the studio, but I've got a Yamaha CS15, which is sort of like this. It was sort of like Yamaha's version. It's only two oscillators, but it's got a really interesting signal path, really killer synthesizer from late 70s. But we used all that stuff in our shows that we were playing at around that time. Real quick, though, was the X-Ray Cafe, was that Paul Thomas's place?
That's right. It was Paul Thomas's. It was the last shop that he had in Athens before he sort of retired from being a retail. And we used to just go in there and mostly just to talk to Paul and drink coffee and just kind of waste time between either a show that was down the street or there was a record store. And at one point I walked in and he had a Farfisa in the back of the store where he had laid a book across the keys and was running the output through some kind of delay that one of the Elephant Six guys lent him. And I walked in, I was like, Paul, what record are you playing? I don't recognize it. Because he goes, oh no, it's this thing in the back. And he just had it going there, and it created this fantastic ambiance. And that's kind of when I got the idea. I was like, oh, you know what? We should do some electronic music stuff here. And then eventually people just kind of came out of the woodwork. And
wow, that is cool. Makes me miss Athens.
Yeah. Athens is kind of different these days, but
Yeah, that's another connection that we have with Joe is that we, Pat and I basically grew up in Athens, and Joe lives there now. But how long have you been in Athens, Joe?
I think we got here in, 93, like beginning of 93.
Well, about the early parts of the MiniMoog, I wanted to ask you a couple of things about that. So I'm continually fascinated about the prototypes, the first three models. It is funny as a sidebar. Like, I know that the reason they call it the Model D is because it was the fourth in a series of, Model A, B, C, and D. But it is kind of funny because for years I thought, oh, well, maybe they only ran 1,000 of the Model A or something like that, but no one else has any of the other ones. To say it's the Model D is a little redundant in my opinion, but I understand why they do. Anyway, I was curious, in your research, were you able to see any of those prototypes or lay hands on them or hear them?
Yes. Yes, for sure. So I became aware of the prototypes pretty early on because back then they were in a museum in Calgary, and they had been scooped up by a collector who used them as part of his collection. And the name's in the book. I can't remember what it was called. But then an organization that was known until very recently as MiniMoog up in Pennsylvania acquired them. And I think now they're called the Museum of Musical Technology, and it's up in Harleysville, Pennsylvania. And I, during the process of writing the book, I spoke to a lot of people who had put hands on them. And then when we went to photograph them up in Harleysville, I got to see them and touch them. And at one point I asked if, well, can you plug them in so we can hear what they sound like? And they very smartly said to me, it's like, putting electricity to these things could be very dangerous and might ruin them. And so we don't do that. I mean, they have been pulled apart and examined and they've got tons and tons of data on them. But yeah, so those machines haven't been heard for a long, long time. Recently, I think it was back in early November, the MMT did a partnership with the Bob Moog Foundation, and they brought all 4 of the prototypes, because there is a pre-Model D prototype that was kind of souped up for an in-house musician. And they brought them all down to the Moogseum in Asheville, and they were on display, and people could come and look at them. And the guys from the MMT were there and talking about them. And because of the span of time that this book took to finish, I've forgotten more about the MiniMoog than I currently remember. That's why I was like, when you asked me about who did I speak to, I was like, well, if you could open the index, I could tell you tons of stories, but I've forgotten a lot of it. But the prototypes are very cool. I have a special affection for the Model A just because I think it's so neat looking. It actually got played by the guys in Mother Mallard's. David Borden, who was going to school over there at Cornell and got to hang out, and basically at some point just got free run of the Moog factory, was one of the first people who really took the Model A and used it and performed with it. It has been recorded, but the last time I spoke to David, he believes that those recordings don't exist anymore. Or if they exist, they certainly didn't make it to the records that they put out. But it's just so cool. It's boxy. It's weird looking. It's got the funky slider on it. And, having, talked to everybody who was involved in the creation of that first machine, it's just so neat to think that, it was just like such a logical thing. I'm tired of patching. Let's just hotwire these things in the back. We'll cut off a keyboard, put it here, and you get somebody who comes into the factory and wants a demo. Let's just do it with this. And, then it was just like, I bet we could sell that.
Yeah, it was interesting reading that part of the book and hearing and to just discover that Bob Moog initially didn't want to have anything to do with that kind of a cut down version. It's like, this thing doesn't do what the device is intended to do. Don't do that. I wasn't aware of that. And then I guess later on can you track the development of what brought him around?
Yeah, lack of money.
Right.
At some point, the company was edging ever closer to being, just insolvent, I guess. And Bob had been going around the country speaking with some people and looking for backers, because he had had so much success with being connected to the Switched on Bach album that, won a Grammy and was just kind of at the forefront of music technology. But he couldn't find the right partner, and he was going around giving lectures and stuff. And at some point, it was just a question of survival. They needed, the famous story is that he was going out on the road to either do a lecture tour or to scare up, money from another investor or something like that. And he, the engineers were like, Dad's gone. So if we don't get something functional and working like right now, we're not going to have jobs anyway. He doesn't want us to go forward with the production of this. But if either way, we're going to lose. So why not go ahead and try it? And sure enough, they went and, got the boards wired up together. And when he came back, he was not happy that they defied his will and gave everyone his engineers a severe talking to.
Because wasn't and I can't remember that, was it Hagsmith, the engineer that he built it was sort of like a demo model so that he could shop I presumably like the bigger modular stuff to customers. So it's like, hey, here's something I can bring into a prospective client to demo. Is that right?
Yeah. So people would often, and sometimes very famous people would stop by, the factory up there, outside of Ithaca, New York, and in Trumansburg, and would, want a demo. And there was an in-house musician, and they were able to, show people that. But it took so long just to say, well, here's a French horn sound. Oh, you want to hear, a clarinet? Give me a second, while right. So it was much more efficient for them to take some oscillators, a filter, an amplifier, and just put them all together. And that was enough for most people to see the variety. And what's amazing about the MiniMoog is that, people will look at it, especially experienced, synthesists will look at it and go, well, it does this thing really well, but more often than not, the people who I interviewed for this book would tell me that, it does so much more. It is so much more a Swiss Army knife than people, give it credit for. It can come up with incredible sounds. And the argument plays out because when you look at, especially if you go back to the index and you look at how many different types of people used it in different styles of music, and how, the range of the instrument is just, it's right there, in terms of the records it appears on.
Yeah. I mean, it can do a lot. I think it does stuff. And it's also, you can have, we all know the story too, that you can have two of them that are one serial number digit apart.
Yes.
And the tuning and the filter may sound a little different. They're so idiosyncratic, especially the older ones. They're not as stable, and that adds that character. And so it's such a unique sound. I had another question. So what all was in their product line previous to the MiniMoog? It was just, I was under the understanding they did custom modular jobs and theremins or something. Is that right? Or
yeah, I don't even know if they were making any theremins towards the end of the 60s or not. I'm definitely not a Moog scholar in along those lines, but they had different models of modulars where you could get, sort of the big, middle, or small versions of them. And there was a sequencer that had been built to use with the modulars, I think, as well. But beyond that, I don't think there were any other models being sold, kind of circa 1970, 71. I don't think so.
Is it safe to say, Joe, that the market for the modular Moog prior to the MiniMoog was recording studios and music departments at colleges. Was that kind of the market? And then it sounds like they kind of backed into having a more affordable instrument that could be sold to rock musicians, kind of accidentally.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Commercial jingle studios, universities, and like the Rolling Stones.
Those that could afford it.
That's right. Those who could afford it. There's some great footage on YouTube of Keith Richards playing with the modular that Mick Jagger bought. But yeah, and that's the thing. Not only were they kind of had sold as many as they were going to sell to the likely customers, but they were, those people who were still waiting, for instruments. It was a tremendous backlog. I mean, these things they were all hand built. It took a long time to make them, and they were being put together by just basically local townspeople who weren't necessarily, had engineering backgrounds. They were just people in Trumansburg who, needed a job and were able to, solder one thing to another. They were backlogged as well. So you didn't have an expanding customer base. The customer base that you had already locked in were getting cranky about where's my synthesizer, where's my music machine of the future. And so it was a big kind of, tug of war between what to do next and what they did well already. Plus Bob's attitude was that what he wanted to do, the famous line from Bob is that, we build Cadillacs. We don't build, Priuses. So, but at the same time, he would go to these trade shows and he would go to these Audio Engineering Society gatherings, and he could see that the competition was starting to creep up. People were making smaller portable machines, and if they didn't get something out there, they were going to be left behind. So finally, his hand was just kind of forced on the issue.
Who were some of the early adopters in the rock idiom of rock or pop of the MiniMoog?
One of the first adopters was the Afrofuturist Sun Ra. He actually took the Model B prototype out on the road.
No way.
With him. Yeah. In fact, it's people who know this kind of synthesizer lore. They actually came through in their psychedelic Cadillacs into this tiny little town of Trumansburg and made quite a stir, and they got a demo, and he walked away with one of the Model B prototypes that were built. There were only two of those. So, and then when he broke it, you can actually see it. And I think, is the movie called Space is the Place? Is that the name of the Sun Ra movie from the early 70s? Well, you can see it. There's a scene where somebody goes in to speak to him, and he's kind of sitting in like a teller window of some sort, and you can see the Model B there. You can see it in the performance cool. segments. And when he broke it, he basically he put the cover back on it, and he took it down to the airport, and he just sent it to Trumansburg, and it arrived at this tiny little airport, and then somebody called Moog and said, "Hey, we got this thing. Is this yours?" He goes, "Yeah, it's ours. Just send it on over." So he was definitely, an innovator with that. The jazz guys, I think, basically got to it for Dick Hyman, famous for the Minotaur. That track also had a Model B at his disposal. But then, on come, the rock guys, pretty quickly.
That was my sense, that it was basically started with, Wakeman and Emerson and some of those guys. I don't know if Jan Hammer is in here. George Duke is up here pretty early.
Yeah. So those guys got a jump start, especially Keith, because as one of their signature artists, Keith got a look at pretty much everything they did right away. And, he put a MiniMoog on top of his organ at some point and was playing with it. once the word got around that this thing was out there, and even though it was very expensive, and I'm sure if you picked up a MiniMoog, it doesn't feel portable to me. I don't move the one in my studio at all, but it's a lot more portable than the modulars. So, the salesman who would go around the country and show it to young, up and coming, aspiring, flared jeans, prog rock artists, they thought, this is great. This is the future, and they would sell them, on consignment or whatever you call it, layaway, to a lot of these young musicians that were looking to become the next Keith Emerson.
I was listening to some of the Mother Mallard stuff, and it's like, it could be in there, but it was difficult to tell. But do you know what was the first record that featured a Model D, or is that even on record somewhere? Like,
I know Sun Ra did record the Model B. I don't know if those recordings came out contemporary with the sessions, but he probably is the first person to record a MiniMoog of any kind. There was Bill Hemsath, when he was still kind of playing with the Model A. I know that he took it home on vacation to Cleveland, and he actually demonstrated it on what would become an NPR station over there in Cleveland. Cool. And as much as I tried to find that recording, it apparently is lost to time. Because that probably would have been the very first, instance of hearing a MiniMoog on record or on tape on the radio.
Now, you all were talking about the growing marketplace for monophonic synthesizers, or more portable, affordable, such as it were. Like, I know that there are other manufacturers, their first offerings were, for the most part, either about the same time or a little afterwards. Like Yamaha had the SY1, which I think is 1974. I read that the ARP 2600 is 1971. Did anyone beat the MiniMoog to market? There were lots of manufacturers that kind of went up in flames after one or two offerings, but
yeah, there was definitely there were kit makers. I think Paya was in fact the fellow who played with Peter Gabriel, Larry
Fast. Yeah.
Larry Fast, yeah. He was also a great person to talk to. He was a college DJ, and he actually got to interview Yes on one of their first tours of the States, and he had already been experimenting with these Paya kits, and he demoed one for Rick Wakeman, and Rick Wakeman actually commissioned him to make him a Paya synth. So that was early on, and of course EMS, right? EMS,
That's right.
Had the Synthy, was the VCS3, sorry,
VCS3
was out there. I think, and I want to say that when Bob went to England and actually met Keith Emerson for the first time, he also got to meet the EMS guys and got to see what they were doing. I could be wrong about that, but I think that actually did happen.
That reminds me about the are you familiar with the EML Electrocomp?
Oh yeah, the 101, right?
Is that that's around the same time, I think?
Yeah. Interesting story about the Electrocomp was that there's that famous James Brown song where that features that synthesizer intro, that wow, 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 wow. I forget what the name of that song is, but that was long thought to be a MiniMoog. And I actually interviewed somebody from his band and said, "Oh yeah, I bought the MiniMoog to James, and he just walked in one day and he literally came up with that riff, and it's on the record just as he played it." And I because I always, especially with people who are now in their 70s, and it's just been a long time ago. I mean, hell, I can't remember a lot of the details myself. I would double and triple check sources, and I found the guy who actually engineered that record, and he said, yeah, that's not a MiniMoog, because I went and I was the one who actually bought it for the band, and it was an Electrocomp.
Cool.
Wow. Yeah, those are super rare. I mean, you think MiniMoogs are expensive now. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Yeah. What year did the Odyssey come out? Was that was maybe a little after the MiniMoog, I think, right? So
I want to say that there was a meeting of the Audio Engineering Society in 71. It's the one thing that I really wanted to put in the book that we somehow didn't get in the book, but there was a program, as you can imagine, for people who attended these conferences, and there was an ad Bob had taken out for the MiniMoog. It was actually spelled as two words. And it was kind of, I think the ad was trying to position it as something for classrooms.
Right.
But that meeting in 71 of the Audio and Engineering Society, all the other players came to the table. ARP was there with...
the 2600, yeah.
2600 was there.
Right.
And all those, and so it was basically, that was where a lot of these instruments were unveiled for the first time. So the competition was right there in front. I'm sure EMS was at that as well. So, and in fact, there's a good story in the book about the night before Bob actually presented the Mini along with one of his engineers. They were still working on it in the hotel room, like the night before, to make sure that it worked. And this was very often the case, even back to this very well-known performance of the first modulars at the Museum of Modern Art. There's pictures of it all over the web. Those guys were still like hot wiring stuff together the day of the performance, and it was very touch and go in a lot of ways. But, Bob was so talented that, he could just knuckle down and do that. Somebody else, that was a good story that Rick Wakeman told me, is that, MiniMoogs were always subject to a lot of radio interference. And one time they were playing somewhere up in, I guess it was in Toronto. Is that right? Toronto. And they were just, taxi signals were coming through the MiniMoog, and Bob happened to be there visiting them to see the show. And in the middle of the, there was a break. This was probably close to the Edge tour, and there was a break in the show, and Bob literally went on stage and started putting tinfoil inside the MiniMoog to reduce the RF interference, and he was still putting the MiniMoog back together while the curtain was coming up on the second set. So, and he didn't notice, he didn't notice the applause. He was that focused, and he got the job done. And he whispered to Rick, and it's like, okay, I think this is good. And Rick pointed out to the audience, like 20,000 people, watching this. And he said, yeah, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob Moog. And he got a big standing ovation,
cool.
kind of applause and stuff like that. So, yeah, that was one of the good stories that Rick came up with for this.
I wonder if there was anything distinct that you noticed about, especially in your interviews with some of these artists, or even just in your research in general. Was there anything that you saw as kind of set apart about how the prog rock guys looked at the instrument, and why the MiniMoog became such? If you're in a prog rock band, you got to have a MiniMoog. You got to have a 20-minute MiniMoog solo in 7/8 time, and with a cape and everything. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that from your research or anything.
I mean, prog rock, being progressive, right? And synthesizers were, at the time that they started to become popularized, that was the sound of the future. So how could you not have the sound of the future if you could all of a sudden, pack it away into a smallish case, like the rest of your gear, right? So those guys, all gravitated to that instrument because it kind of extended, the psychedelic vibe of 3-4 years ago into this very futuristic thing. And a lot of this stuff was in the culture, right? I mean, 2001 being out there as a film. People were very obsessed with, modernism, and especially when it came to music sounds. So it was a way to import that vibe into your band, for a reasonable amount of money.
That makes sense.
Joe, how reliable of a live instrument were the early MiniMoogs? We always hear horror stories about the Mellotrons, and tuning a Mellotron doesn't, is the famous quote. But were MiniMoogs any better? Were they just super temperamental?
Yeah, they were super temperamental. Not only were they subject to RF frequency, the original oscillator boards inside the Model D were very sensitive to temperature. So, you'd go on stage, big empty arena, you'd set up the MiniMoog, you'd tune it, and then all of a sudden 20,000 people walk in, the temperature changes, and it is wildly out of tune, right? Mm-hmm. And, the MiniMoog does feature that tuning, that A441 tuning circuit in it to help alleviate that, but it could shift incredibly wildly in the middle of a performance, and that was definitely one of the downsides. I have a good friend, Jareth, I think he goes under the YouTube name of Synth Pro, who is a MiniMoog expert and who was real instrumental in helping us understand some of the technical evolution from one set of oscillator boards to the next, and how it became more stable, as it got closer and closer to the end of the run. But at the same time, as a result, lost a little bit of the grit and growl. Because of the change in circuitry. So you have these divided, players in the community of I want to play this in tune. So I'm going to go with a newer version that's actually stable. And then other people are like, I'll deal with that later. I want to record this thing the way untamed, the way it was meant to be heard. Mm-hmm. Right. So, but yeah, they were extremely unstable, and like Pat was saying before, it could vary from instrument to instrument. One of the great things about, doing this book was I would give different names to the MiniMoogs that we came across in the research, because they each had their, like the Portishead Mini that was painted all psychedelic with the eyeball in it, which nobody seems to know where it is. They all had, distinct characteristics.
Yeah, I had a 1976 MiniMoog for just I have a silly story about it. My wife kind of went in cahoots with this friend of mine that would come see me play. He would come up to me and say, "Oh, Pat, you gotta try my MiniMoog." He was a real fast talking guy, and he had this old 76 MiniMoog that it was just sitting around. And he's like, I want to sell it to you. And I'm like, well, okay. I don't have $7,000 or whatever, And anyway, long story long is my wife kind of brokered a deal with him so that we could basically rent it for a year. And so I had it in my studio. I didn't use it as much as I thought I would, but man, just the gravity of that device was so... I mean, it's physically heavy and imposing. Don't let the mini prefix fool you. No. I mean, Joe, if you have one, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah. But this is an older one, and not the earlier stage. I think he said it was a 76. I'm trying to remember if it had it had the ribbed mod wheels on the side. But it did, man. It just there was just a sound to it that was, and it would drift out of tune, and it was super weird, and I know that the older ones were even worse. But just the kind of sound you could get out of that too, you almost didn't know what was going to come out of it next.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, if you're into electronic music and you recognize that a band like Kraftwerk is sort of at the heart of a lot of the sounds that we enjoy and chase and things like that. I mean, those guys had a MiniMoog very early on, and it is the sound of Trans Europe Express. I mean, it is on those early records, and they didn't let it go. I mean, when I was very young, and they came to tour Computer World in New York City, and I desperately wanted to go, but God knows what I did wrong. I didn't take out the trash or something, and I was punished and couldn't go see Kraftwerk. But if you look at pictures from that period where they had the big consoles, there are MiniMoogs built into those consoles, those performance things with lights on them and stuff like that. So, it has a foundational, legacy in terms of and to even stretch that further, the fact that 95% of keyboards of any stripe have a mod wheel. And that didn't exist until the Model A had that slider. If you go to the grave with that kind of a legacy, you got to be pretty proud of yourself.
I think the proof of the MiniMoog as kind of a singular cultural phenomenon, and the fact that it really is a real instrument. It's not a threat to union musician jobs. It's not, it's not some sci-fi trick. It's an actual musical instrument to be wielded by, in many cases, real musicians. Is the fact that some of these guys, and I'm thinking of the 70s where most of my listening happens, had such a singular tone on the instrument. When I hear, for example, Kit Watkins from the band Happy the Man, on the MiniMoog, he was a poet and painter on that thing. He had his own tones, and I hear two notes and I know who it was. And there's other guys like, I don't know, Patrick Moraz or somebody, Pat can jump in and remind me, George Duke maybe, that had their own tones, their own sounds. And to me, that's the proof that it really is, it's a real live functioning instrument for musicians.
Absolutely. The fella from Heart, I can't claim, just because of my generation, I can't claim to be a big Heart fan. But when he told me about how they would open a Heart concert in a big stadium once those guys got so big, maybe Pat, how to do this, but he would be able to tune the MiniMoog to the standing wave of the arena. And as they would come on stage and the lights are going up, and so he would just hit like the low note, which is already pre-tuned to the standing wave of the arena, and he would just literally shake the building. That was a pretty cool way to to kick off a show.
I don't know how to do that yet, but now that you mention it, I'm looking that up. This is one of the true uses of ChatGPT. I'm looking that up immediately. I think that's a really good point, and especially since this is because I don't think preset memory became a common feature of any synthesizer device, like a programmable synthesizer, until I think that there were other versions of synths that had this, but I think it was the Prophet 5 in 78 that sort of introduced a more standardized, like, okay, we're going to have, 128 or 64 presets or whatever.
Right.
So you had to know how to program that thing and be ready to have it ready for the next tune. Man, as an active musician myself, I don't take, I don't know if you can see, I've got a grandmother back there, which is,
awesome,
a young and diminutive cousin to the MiniMoog, and I don't take that thing out because I don't want to have to program it for playing the next tune in my set. It takes a lot of, I think it takes a lot of you got to have some ingenuity to know how to get ready for that next thing. And so guys like Wakeman, like I'm the same way. Like when you hear Wakeman, it's Wakeman. When you hear Emerson, it's him on a MiniMoog.
And another good person who would have multiple MiniMoogs on stage for that purpose is somebody like Blue Weaver when he was playing keyboards with the Bee Gees, who came up with that very distinctive honking kind of bass sound. I mean, Nights on Broadway is one of those tracks where, I mean, if you want to hear what a MiniMoog can do in terms of MiniMoog can do in terms of helping people, get funky and dance. I mean, that's just an incredible performance.
I love that bass part.
Yeah.
And I've actually played it before, and it's like, man, and what do? You pull up, I mean, for me, it's main stage using native instruments, the Monarch, or it's just it's a MiniMoog clone. But well, and I'm glad you brought up that whole idea, because I've run across Gary Wright before and noticed his band of Moog. And Brian and I, just before our call, I was trading back videos of like, dude, did you know that Gary Wright's band, he had like 3 keyboard players and no guitar player, and they all had, it wasn't just a MiniMoog, but like they were chopped off.
Yeah.
And he was doing it like keytar style.
Yeah, Gary was funny, because when I spoke to him, it wasn't too long before he passed away, actually. He called me from his car, and he was driving on Mulholland Drive. He probably forgotten that we were scheduled to chat. But he claimed, I'm pretty sure, and it may be in the book, I'm not sure, there's some things had to be, again, filtered out because of further research, but I think he claimed to be the first person to disconnect the keyboard from the MiniMoog and play it keytar style. I mean, he certainly became well known for it after a while, but he says he was the first person to do it.
I believe it, because it was multiple MiniMoog. It wasn't just his. You saw the Steve Porcaro actually was the other guy who was, I think he's stage right. He's wearing the weird culty looking orange jumpsuit.
Right.
on some of those what was it, Midnight Special and stuff like that.
He's another great player. Somebody, and again, I'm not a Toto fan by any stretch of the imagination, but he's also somebody who had nothing but tremendous amounts of praise for how the Moog sound played into those early records, and how he really just could, no matter how he tried. In fact, I think he did like a learn how to synthesize kind of video. Again, it's something you can find on YouTube. And he talks about, programming bass sound and how he just always comes back to the MiniMoog because he just wasn't able to find something that was able to beat, that instrument in that register.
It's like, why bother talking about how many records it was on? It was on every record. It was. Yeah. It makes no sense to describe how many people breathe oxygen. It's like, well, we all do.
Right.
It's so ubiquitous, Well, I noticed you also touched on the Starbuck hit "Moonlight Feels Right."
Oh, I love that song. Which, maybe ironically, but I love that song.
Well, I very non-ironically met Bruce Blackman years ago at a studio in Atlanta, and we got to talking. That guy was a trip, because he was telling me that, because I guess at the time they would have 2 guys playing 2 MiniMoogs.
Yeah.
I remember that in the chorus, there's this, Moonlight, and so they would have 2 guys playing that stack of synths.
Yeah.
For that part.
Yeah. I forget the guy who actually who I interviewed from that band, because he still lives in Atlanta. I think he's a professor at Georgia State University. And he told me that everybody in that band, including the drummer, had a MiniMoog. There were like 6 MiniMoogs at their disposal for when they got together. So,
Joe, I've got a question here too. I remember in the 90s, Pat and I could afford vintage keys in the pawn shops when we ran across them for $75 or $150. And then in the 90s, there was some kind of popular renaissance of the Moog. What could you tell us about that renaissance, if it actually really was a renaissance in the 90s?
No, you're definitely right. I lay the blame entirely at the feet of Stereolab.
Oh, yeah.
Because those guys, did they have an Opus as well? I'm pretty sure at one point or another those guys touched every vintage keyboard, and people like Air, that French band. I mean, once those records started to become cool and hip, that sound was back. And you're right. I interviewed a technician in Atlanta who used to work with Bruce Springsteen. A real well-known guy he's passed away now, but he was big in the. You go over to his house and there's just literally every synthesizer that you can imagine, just in parts all over his workshop. But he told me that the MiniMoog he bought, he paid in the mid '80s. He paid $150 with the flight case. Okay,
no way.
Because nobody wanted them, and between the English bands were those kind of post rock bands like Stereolab and Air, and the fact that a lot of hip hop guys were, once those guys started chasing that Parliament Funkadelic sound, that was also it just easier to get a MiniMoog, and then you don't have to pay any sampling, cost on top of that. So that became, so you had those two things happening more or less at the same time. And then, there was nothing, now you want to buy a vintage MiniMoog, you're going to, especially if it's one from the early 70s and it's been restored, $7,000 to $10,000 is generally the going rate. There's a lot of argument against spending that kind of money over plugins or, things that emulate those sounds now. But it is something to hear, when you get put it in front of somebody, like we were talking about Jareth over in Alabama, Jareth Lackey, who repairs those things. He's just a wizard, just to see somebody like that who knows the ins and outs of that circuitry and who can play as well. I mean, it's something to behold,
Joe, could you remind us the title of your book and where, if you're like me and want to buy it now, where can I buy the book? Where should I buy the book?
Yeah, so just go over to Bjooks.com, and that's spelled the Danish way, BJOOKS.com, and it's just called The MiniMoog Book, the synthesizer that changed music forever.
Awesome.
But I will say, it had nothing to do with me, in terms of the words. But if you're into electronic music and the pictures that we scared up, like, days before we had to send this thing to the printer, we found some great Pink Floyd pictures that I'm pretty sure have never been seen before. And we got them into the book at the very last minute. So we were dealing with a lot of like photographers from that era, rock photographers. So there's some very cool stuff. Some of the Rush photos are pretty nice as well. And I became talk about the fallout from the book. I think, Pat, you would probably say being in the blast radius of all of these.
That is a Pat thing to say.
These prog bands. I was, when I was growing up, the most uncool band that you could like was Rush. But I became such a massive fan of Rush and Geddy Lee, and we were so psyched when he, offered to write the forward for this. I mean,
nice.
It's just, and now I kick myself for all, being that 16-year-old kid who was, I'm not going to go see Rush. What are you? I would kill to be able to see them, back 81, 82, 83, that heyday. I mean, I would just love to have caught those shows.
Thanks for joining us again on this episode of Underdubs. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. See you next time.